All right. Looks like that is up to scratch. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Good afternoon to everyone. I'm so glad you can join me as we are going to be discussing Parashat Shemini. And as we continue our push through the book of Vayikra, the book of Exodus, there are so many different things that can grab our attention. Shemini is famous, of course, for the passing of Nadav and Avihu, the two sons of Aaron, who die at the beginning of this Torah portion. But it is equally famous for being the introduction in explicit detail of the rules of Kashrut. And it is from those rules that we are going to put our attention this week. Particularly, we're going to start off by looking at the rules governing the Kashrut of birds, because birds stand out. I don't just mean that they fly around, but I mean birds stand out because unlike the rules for other types of animals to be consumed, we don't get a list of the defining characteristics of the birds. Instead, we get a list of birds that are not allowed to be eaten. And this really does help us ask the question that we should be asking about all of the other commandments as well, particularly in Kashrut, but really all of them, which is why? Why these? Sure, it's easy to say, well, we don't eat the land animals that don't chew their cud and don't have a cloven hoof, because those are the signs we've been given. But when you really spell out the name of the animals like we do for the birds, it becomes more necessary, hopefully, to incline ourselves towards trying to understand why this, why these and not those. So first we have to go ahead and go through the list and talk about that a little bit. We'll look at some of our commentary, and then we will expand our view to some of the big picture questions. So let's get down to reading from the Torah, beginning here with chapter 11, verse 13. The following you shall abominate, which is my new favorite verb. Thank you, old JPS translation. You shall abominate among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. As I have said in many other contexts, the phrase abomination does not mean the same thing that it means in English. Yes, tishaktu, as the phrase here, a sheketz, means something that is just bleh, but it does not mean like the most horrific thing on the face of the planet. It means something that you should avoid, something that you should feel a push against in order that you not transgress. So turn down the dial from 11. Abomination means that they are prohibited, but it doesn't have a special form of prohibition compared to any other commandment where that verb is not used. It's simply saying, do not ingest these. This is what you should treat the same way that you would treat any other thing that you would not think of eating. You shouldn't even be thinking of eating these as well. And what are they? The eagle, the vulture, and the black vulture, the kite, falcons of every variety, all varieties of raven, or really ravens and all of its varieties, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, the hawks of every variety, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the pelican, the bustard, the stork, herons of every variety, the hopi, I always have fun with that English word, and the bat. That's our list. Now, you're probably wondering, because I'm sure that all of you are linguistic mavens, how we know which animal on the face of the earth each one of these words is pointing at. It sounds very easy when we begin, eagle and vulture. Sure, I know what an eagle looks like. I know what a vulture looks like. On the other hand, when we start differentiating between an eagle, a vulture, and a black vulture, a kite and a falcon of every variety, well, where exactly is the taxonomy in these categories? How do I know which one is which? But really, that's the only the second level question. If we go even deeper, the question becomes, how do I know that the word eagle means the same to me as it did to somebody not only who was speaking Hebrew, but was speaking Hebrew 3,000 years ago. How do I know what they were pointing at? Were they pointing at exactly the same thing as me, or were they pointing at a different type of bird? And since unique among the list of things that are not kosher, birds don't tell us the symbol, the sign for what makes them not kosher, we are left upon visual identification and shared cultural understanding. And as we're going to see, there is not a universal understanding for the identity of all these birds. Don't despair. That doesn't mean that you're eating things not kosher when you eat a bird. It doesn't mean that you have to stop eating birds altogether. It just means that we're going to have to investigate this with a little bit more analysis than just relying upon the translation as it sits on the page. All right, now we've got a lot of commentary today. So are there any questions on this or this concept before we jump into it?
I point out that in the Chumash and the pews that it's going to read differently. The old JPS has, you shall not have in detestation versus abomination, and then gives a list of the great vulture, the bearded vulture, the osprey, the kite. So there's already discrepancy. This is one of these times I like the art scroll because they don't even bother. They just give the Hebrew names.
And they did that very deliberately because they knew that any connection to an English word, even if, and this is a very important thing to understand about language, even if the translation was 100% correct into English from the Hebrew, that doesn't mean that that English word would still mean that in another 100 years. That English, like every language, continues to move. My favorite, easiest example for everyone to comprehend, if you go back into the King James version of the Bible, way back in the old days of English, and you look up what were they building in the land of Egypt, they were placing places to store corn. Well, that don't make sense because corn is a new world grain, right? Corn is grown by Indians. What do you mean they were making places to grow corn or to store corn? No, in Old English, well, not even that old of English, corn simply meant grain. And that was one of the other words. Now, corn eventually comes to mean 90% of the time in modern English, that particular type of grain that grows onto the stalk with the little yellow kernels, bumpy and all of that we know and love so well. But if someone were to have said, well, corn was absolutely the right word when King James was having that Bible commissioned, that doesn't mean it's still the right word in 2022. So yes, I absolutely do applaud ArtScroll in this case of keeping it as being just the Hebrew, because that is about as much comprehension as the average reader should be getting from the list of these birds. All right, so let's jump in and talk about them. Come on. Why are you not? Hold on. There. Had a little bit of technical difficulty there. It didn't want to scroll up to the top of the page, but now it is. Okay, so let's talk about this. The meaning of nesher is known. This is also the bird which has the same name in the language of the Ishmaelites, meaning in Arabic, where it's called nisr, which you can hear the similarity linguistically. There is something of a proof at this case because the two languages are related. And indeed, many modern scholars have tried to use Arabic or other cognate languages that are similar to Hebrew, being other Semitic languages, to try and identify the particular species that are mentioned here in our Torah reading. However, what Ibn Ezra didn't understand, because linguistics was still quite in an infancy at the time as a philosophical study, is that just because they are currently pointing to a particular category of birds and saying nisr does not mean that's what their ancestors 2,000 years prior would have pointed at and said the same thing. That just like in English, Arabic, other languages, the references that are made between a word and its object can shift. So that is not foolproof. And indeed, there is a very long discussion about Nesher not being an eagle at all, in the way that we mean eagle in modern English, but instead being a particular type of vulture that is in Israel in particular, and has many of the same features that are ascribed to the Nesher poetically, found in the rest of biblical poetry and imagery. So if you want more of that, read Rabbi Natan Slifkin's book on the animals of the Bible. He has whole essays on how we should identify the Nesher, commonly mistakenly, in his opinion, and I think he makes a good argument, understood as an eagle, but in fact being a vulture. But of course, vulture has a different feeling in English, and so people are resistant to the shift. Onward. Even though there is an individual opinion that the osprey is not found in inhabited places, the Gaon, meaning the great sage that he was quoting from, erred in rendering it al-enka. For this term in the language of the Ishmaelites, Arabic again, refers to something that never existed. So the Gaon that he's quoting decided that the word that we translate as osprey would be al-enka in the Arabic, but that term in Arabic actually doesn't mean just bird, it means a particular mythological bird. It refers to something that was not created and never was. It is only employed metaphorically. This being the case, it is not possible that the Torah would prohibit something that never existed. It'd be the equivalent of trying to translate it into English with the word phoenix. Phoenixes don't exist in the way that the English word phoenix seems to suggest they do. And so if you were to say the Torah was prohibiting the eating of a phoenix, you would be left with the question of, why is the Torah telling me not to eat something that I can't eat because it doesn't exist? And the Torah deals with things that actually exist. Very good point from Ibn Ezra, and one that really does remind us that as we try to understand these passages, we are dealing with not only the philosophical, metaphysical, epistemological discussion of what exists and doesn't exist and what these words mean, but we're also worried about what I'm going to buy at the supermarket, that there is always a practical layer under all of this that needs to be kept in mind, so that we are not merely studying this academically. Now, JPS, in their commentary and their very common phrase, a number of these cannot be identified with certainty. And, you know, that is a very useful term and a very honest one, the same way that Art Scroll just leaves them in Hebrew, because they cannot be identified against an English word with some certainty. But that still might leave us then thinking we're not going to be able to eat any birds. But that would then also imply that we're looking at this in the wrong way. So first of all, I realized I just realized that I put the there we are, the texts in the wrong order. So we'll come back to Abarbanel in just a second, but we are going to start off with Rabbeinu Bachia instead to talk us a little bit more about the halacha that we need to know. The Torah lists only the impure ones by name, since they are in the minority and make a shorter list. Beautiful practicality, right? Why didn't the Torah give us a list of the pure birds rather than a list of the impure? Because there are many more pure birds, meaning birds that are kosher, than non-kosher. And if you're making a list, you write the smaller list. The Torah follows this principle when writing. You shall distinguish between the clean, pure animals and the unclean, impure, and between the unclean bird and the clean. Notice the subtle shift of word order. When we deal between clean animals and unclean, well, then we have the order with the clean coming first and then the unclean coming second. And on the opposite side, because the clean animal list is shorter, and on the opposite side, when we do birds, we say the unclean first and then the clean, because the unclean are the shorter list. When mentioning the four-legged animals, as the Torah first mentioned the pure categories, as they are fewer than the impure beasts, in the case of the birds, the Torah referred first to the unclean birds, as they are fewer than the clean birds. Good, close reading. Any bird which attacks with its claws is automatically known as an unclean bird. And in fact, this is part of the signs that the rabbis derive from looking at the examples of these birds of what would be an indication of an unclean bird. And one of the preeminent signs is that the animal is a predator, meaning a raptor in the modern term of the word, that it grabs and rips apart its prey as it eats it, like you can imagine a hawk or a owl or a falcon doing. Now, that means if we come across a bird and we don't know what to call it, because we've never seen a bird like that, like, we move to a new continent or something, if we see it swoop down and grab a mouse and tear it apart as it eats, we know it's not kosher automatically. This is why there was never a doubt about the bald eagle in America of whether or not it counts as being a non-kosher bird. Clearly, by its behavior, it is not kosher. But the reason that the Torah forbade consumption of such birds is that it is more hot-blooded. Meaning the character of the bird revealing a cruel streak. Eating such a bird would leave a residue of the character of the animal in the person who consumed it. God hates the negative virtues displayed by birds of prey. This is why the prophets compared evil and cruel people to some birds of prey, such as in Jeremiah 49 and Deuteronomy 28. Evil people have been compared to the predatory animals, such as the lion in Jeremiah 5 and Psalms 58 and Psalms 57. By contrast, the righteous are usually compared to the kind of animals that are harmless, models of creatures with whom one can live in peace. So Rabbeinu Bachya is going to try and get us moving here in the direction that's going to occupy most of our time for today, which is to say, what is it about these birds that made them off limits? What is it about any of the commandments, especially with Kashrut, but any of them really, that makes them reasonable to make it a yes or a no for our behavior? And Rabbeinu Bachya is entertaining the idea that these birds were prohibited not because there was something fundamentally wrong with their meat. It's not like they are poisonous or full of disease, but because there was something flawed in their character vis-a-vis human morality. Now, he's not trying to imply that we should go out and judge all the birds and put them on trial for their cruel behavior. Nor does he really believe that the birds themselves are cruel, as cruel is a moral category which doesn't apply to animals. There is, by the way, if you want to see someone doing that as a bit of satire, there is a wonderful piece written by Mark Twain where animals are being judged in a court of law. But that's a whole nother topic. So what he is trying to say is that by eating certain things or avoiding eating certain things, we are reinforcing the values that God wishes us to value. That by saying these animals are good for you and pointing to those animals as ones that poetically, metaphorically, symbolically, consistently are used throughout the Torah to have good character traits of being peaceful and of being able to live together in harmony, then God is making a statement about how we too should conduct ourselves. And by saying that we should abominate, detest, and reject these other types of animals, which poetically, metaphorically, symbolically are associated with cruel tendencies when applied as descriptions to humans, God is telling us that indeed those types of character traits are wrong, and that we should keep far from those character traits, in addition to keeping far from the meat of these particular birds. And to back that up, we're just going to back up to Abarbanel, who wants to remind us that indeed we should be learning more from what's going on of Kashrut than just what to eat and not eat. Many of the commentators have thought that Kashrut is because of the body's health and medical care, those foods being bad, meaning the foods that are prohibited. But God forbid that I should believe this, because if that were the case, the divine Torah would be on the level of a minor book among the books of medicine, short in both words and reasoning. Now, he doesn't mean that the Torah is unreasonable, but what he means is that if I were going to write a medicine book about what to eat and what not to eat from a health perspective, it would take a lot more room to cover everything than the Torah covers. In addition, the Torah never justifies what you should or shouldn't eat in health ways. It never explains why it would be good for the body or bad for the body. And that is what you would look for in a medical book. You would like the actual, underlying reasoning of why eat this and why not eat that. And that was the type of medical books that Abarbanel was familiar with. Clearly, the Torah was not written in that style. Additionally, we can see with our own eyes that the nations that eat unkosher things are all alive to this day. Right? If non-kosher food was not eaten because it wasn't healthy, then the fact that non-Jews eat non-kosher food all the time should lead to a lack of health among the non-Jews. But they're not. Not in our Barbanel's day, not in our own day. People can sit down and eat non-kosher food all they want, and they will have similar health results to people that eat only kosher food. This shows that the divine Torah does not come to heal the bodies or to seek their health, but rather to promote the health of the soul and heal its ailments. And therefore, it forbade foods that sully and abominate the pure and sublime soul, and that engender in human temperamental mixture and impenetrability and a distortion of desires by creating a bad mixture that gives rise to a spirit of pollution that defiles the mind and the deeds, and that expels the spirit of purity and holiness. Okay. This is where we remember that Abarbanel was writing in the Middle Ages and that this is a translation. What he is trying to say here is well, there's a major point and then a minor point. The major point is that the laws of Kashrut are about our spiritual life, not our physical health. And as such, when we eat, and we keep Kashrut, we are tending to our spiritual health in a very important way by preventing the buildup of this the distortion of desires, as he puts it, this spirit of pollution. Now, the minor question is exactly how he imagined that taking place. Did he imagine this as there was something physical in the meat of non-kosher food that would then bond to the molecules of our own body to create the spirit of pollution? Chances are he didn't, but that doesn't mean that he would be a modern, biologist either. Chances are he believed that there was some sort of spiritual overlay that was transmitted through the eating of something that wasn't kosher. But you will note that he is trying to point out that this is a incompatibility with our life, right? That this is not working well for us because, after all, we were commanded not to eat this. We're going to come back to this question of exactly how is it harming us when we get to some of our later commentators. But let me just finish his commentary first. Scripture, meaning the Torah, does not call them, non-kosher foods, injurious or disease-causing, but impure and abominable. Right? The Torah didn't say these birds should be unhealthy for you or these birds will make you sick. It says you will abominate them, showing that the rationale for the prohibition is on account of the soul and not on account of the body and its health. It was necessary for the wholeness, clarity, and purity of the soul that the bodily temperament would be right, and that its food would create blood that was pure and refined, and not gross and thick, and not right, as would be created by the forbidden foods. And also, the forbidden foods were related to the idolaters. That's a whole nother argument that he introduces. Just wanted to leave it there as a taste. That the Kashrut was also about separating us from the idolatry of the ancient world. So basically what he's trying to say here is that the Kashrut is there because we are spiritually healthier when we attend to the food that God has permitted. But does that mean these animals in particular are a problem? Or does it mean these animals are a problem because they were in particular singled out by Kashrut? So let me just restate that question because it's a very, very important one that we're going to have to wrestle with. Did God say no eagles because eagles are bad for our soul? Or Did God say no eagles because having said no eagles, eagles would be bad for our soul? Meaning, could God have prohibited chicken and achieved the same result? Could God have permitted eagles and achieved the same result? Or is there something intrinsic to eagle meat and chicken meat that puts them in different categories for how they interact with our bodies? Now, that may seem like a trivial question, but it is one that should at least enter our mind so that we know how to psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually come to an answer which allows us to relate to the particulars of any mitzvah, this time kashrut, but it could be anything, whether it be putting up a mezuzah or wearing a talit or wearing tefillin or maintaining many of the other points of Jewish law about business or interpersonal relations. We need to know, is there a reason for these, or is there reason just God wanted there to be rules? And that is something that we need to come to an understanding of. Now, this is only going to be the tip of the iceberg. Obviously, there have been hundreds of scholars who have spent thousands of pages discussing and debating these topics. But I do want to make an attempt, at least, to come to an answer that I at least find very satisfying and important. And I hope that you will as well. And as probably surprises no one, I'm going to be drawing from Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim, from the Guide for the Perplexed, because he is one of the people who speak about this most systematically, most clearly, and despite the clunkiness of translation, in a way that I think will resonate for us, even if it was written 1,000 years ago. So let us begin. Theologians are divided as regard the object of the commandments which God gave us. Some of them hold that the commandments have no object at all and are only dictated by the will of God, right? The commandments don't have a purpose, they don't have a meaning, they don't have anything behind them other than God commanded, and that is full stop, beginning, middle, and end, all that we need to know, and indeed all that can be known. Others are of opinion that all commandments and prohibition are dictated by his wisdom and serve a purpose. Thus, there is a reason for each of the precepts. They are commanded because they are useful. So on the opposite side of there was no reason, it's just what God said, there are always reasons. Every commandment does something useful, and we'll get back to what those things might be in general in a second, but I'm just going to hold off there. Every commandment does something that is useful, and that is why they were commanded. All of us, the common people as well as the scholars, believe that there is a reason for every precept, although there are commandments the reason of which is unknown to us, and in which the ways of God's wisdom are incomprehensible. So this is the bumper sticker version, such as it is, for Rambam's position, that yes, every commandment has a reason, but no, not every reason is understandable to us because, well, God. And sometimes what God does doesn't always make sense to our limited human mind. So we can say they all have reasons, even if we don't know them. But he obviously is going to need to prove this. And his proof, I believe, is enlightening. This view that every commandment has a reason is expressed in Torah. From Deuteronomy 4, righteous statutes and judgments. And also from Psalm, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Now remember, the phrase righteous doesn't just mean like morally good. Righteous means that it is correct, that there is a benchmark that this is being held against, and that they measure up. There are commandments which are called chukim, often translated as ordinances or sort of acts that don't have much explanation, like the prohibition of wearing garments of wool and linen, shatnez, cooking meat and milk together, and the sending of the goat on Yom Kippur, when we had the tent and then later the temple. One goat was sent out to the wilderness, the so-called scapegoat. And all of those do not really lend themselves to an immediate understanding of the reasons behind them. Yes, we have, both together as well as looking through our history, found many explanations, but we can't be sure, and they are often the result of great effort rather than obvious understanding. But our sages generally do not think that such precepts have no cause whatever and serve no purpose. Right? We may not have a perfect understanding of why God ordained these particular hukim, but we know there must be a purpose even if we don't understand it. Because if we thought there was no purpose, this would lead us to assume that God's actions are purposeless, that God just did it, rolled the dice and, rolled the dice and said, wool and linen, you're not going to mix. On the contrary, they, meaning the sages, hold that even these ordinances have a cause, even these which are the most difficult for us to understand, and are certainly intended for some use, although it is not known to us, owing either to the deficiency of our knowledge or the weakness of our intellect. We either don't understand the world well enough to see how it all fits together, or we don't have a mind that can take all the information we do have and put it together into a useful understanding. All right, everybody with me so far? I know philosophy is not everybody's cup of tea, but hopefully the explanation is making some sense. All right. In some cases, as opposed to the chukim, the usefulness is evident. The prohibition of murder and theft. You don't really have to scratch your head all that hard to figure out why not having murder in a community and not allowing theft in a community would be a good thing for everyone. In others, the usefulness is not so evident. For example, the prohibition of enjoying the fruit of a tree in the first 3 years. However, there are ways that we can uncover the usefulness of, for example, the orla mitzvah of the fruit. It just is not immediately obvious. I have found, however, one utterance made by them, the sages in Bereshit Rabbah, which might at first sight appear to imply that some commandments have no other reason but the fact that they are commanded. Right? So he is being an honest, good faith debater. He knows that there is this quote from Bereshit Rabbah, which seems to go against his argument that every commandment has a purpose, right? And he's going to deal with that. That some have no reason, but the fact that they are commanded and that no other object is intended by them, and they do not serve any useful object. And what does he mean? He means the following passage. This is from Bereshit Rabbah. What difference does it make to God whether a beast is killed by cutting the neck in front or in back? Surely the commandments are only intended as a means of trying man. In accordance with the verse, the word of God is a test, taken from Psalm 18. So this passage might on the surface seem to imply that God didn't choose to describe our slaughter of an animal with shrita, the slicing of the throat from the bottom, as opposed to a back decapitation, like with a guillotine on the back of the neck, because of some deep, meaningful reason. God just picked one, and we have to follow it. And the following is what's important, because without a reason, it is a greater test to see whether you will follow the commandment. If your parents tell you exactly why you need to do a chore, it might make it easier to convince the child. If they say, do it because I'm telling you, then when the child does it, it shows greater obedience. That would be one interpretation of this passage. But Rambam is going to push back on that interpretation hard. I will now tell you what intelligent persons ought to believe in this respect. And you know when Rambam starts insulting other people that he's getting serious. Namely, that each commandment has necessarily a cause as far as its general character is concerned and serves a certain object. Every commandment has a purpose, and the basic outline of the commandment definitely has an object. But as regards its details, we hold that it holds no ulterior object. So his argument is going to be that God gave commandments and every commandment has a purpose, but not every detail of that commandment necessarily has a purpose that could only be served by that particular detail. We're going to get some examples of that as he goes on. So if you're not 100% sure what he means by that, it's okay. That's why it's ongoing. Thus, killing animals for the purpose of obtaining good food is certainly useful, as we intend to show. That, however, the killing should not be performed by nechira, the poleaxing of an animal, but by shrita, the cutting of the neck, and by dividing the esophagus and windpipe in a certain place. These regulations and the like are nothing but tests for our obedience. So God wanted us to have a commandment of how we should kill an animal, meaning that there should be a way we kill the animal rather than just tearing it apart like an eagle or tearing it apart like a lion. But the particulars of how that happens were not necessarily part of that overall goal. God could have told us that the knife had to be blue, and that would have been fine, but that particular color would have been part of the testing element of the commandment, as opposed to the purpose of the commandment. Now, he does backtrack on this a little bit with regards to shrita. I give this instance, meaning the example of shrita, only because it has been mentioned by our sages. But in reality, as it has become necessary to eat the flesh of animals, it was intended by the above regulations to ensure an easy death and to effect it by suitable means. Whilst decapitation requires a sword or similar instrument, the shrita can be performed with any instrument. And in order to ensure an easy death, our sages insisted that the knife should be well sharpened. So he says, look, it could have been that God would have chosen to have us cut off the animal's head with an axe rather than with a knife, and that would have been still in keeping with the overall purpose of having a way that we had to slaughter an animal in order that we would be mindful and understand the action that we were about to undertake. However, there are actually reasons for the sub-details of shrita itself, of slaughter. It wasn't only the general that was true, there are also reasons for the specific. The use of a knife was more available to more people, so thus it could be carried out more easily and more correctly, and that it should be done in a way that provides for an easy death, as in many other places, both Rambam and other commentators point out that this is meant to ensure that we also do not become callous to the taking of a life, even for food, for in doing so, we would become callous to life and death with regards to humans as well. Okay, now that's the first specific, but he wants to go into another topic that he thinks is an even better example of what do we ask about and what do we not ask about. And that's going to be sacrifices, which, given that we are in the book of Vayikra, should be right at home with our thinking. A more suitable instance for discussing this general versus specific reasoning can be cited from the sacrificial commandments. The law that sacrifices should be brought is evidently of great use, and he discusses it in much more detail elsewhere, the importance of the physicality and the communal aspects and all of the general rules of sacrifices as being very important for the spirit of the individual as well as the community. But even with that general great use, we cannot say why one offering should be a lamb whilst another is a ram, and why a fixed number of them should be brought. Indeed, I have had many people ask me over the years on these very points. You know, Rabbi, why does it say that for this particular offering we have to have a lamb, but this one it has to be a goat, and this one should be a cow, and this one should be brought in this way, and that one should be brought in that way? And in general, as he's going to point out, we can't say why this one was a lamb or this one was a ram. Now, we can hypothesize, and indeed, commentators have filled books with hypotheses of why it might be a lamb versus a ram or any of the other differences that are there. And many of those insights are incredibly powerful spiritual teachings about how we should view the world. But we must recognize them as being ex post facto interpretations, interpretations that come after the details have been given, not as the reason those details were given in the first place. I mean, after all, the details for alternative numbers could also be given. We could have imagined great insights from flipping many of these, but that does not mean that would have made it a better version of what to do. So what does he say about this? Those who trouble themselves to find a cause for any of these detailed rules are, in my eyes, void of sense, which is a pretty nasty medieval burn. They do not remove any difficulties, but rather increase them, right? If you think you're actually making life better by explaining or trying to explain exactly why number 7 versus 8, why lamb versus ram, you're not helping anything. And he goes on to explain what the problem is. Those who believe that these detailed rules originate in a certain cause are as far from the truth as those who assume that the whole law is useless. Recognize what he's doing here. He is putting a comparison, parallels between those who say Torah is pointless and those who say there is precisely a divine reason why it had to be a lamb for this sacrifice and not a ram. And I'm going to tell you what it is, and anyone who tells you otherwise is a heretic. He is saying, in fact, both of those extremes are heresy. You must know that divine wisdom demanded it, or if you prefer, say that circumstances made it necessary, that there should be parts of his work which have no certain object. Now that may be shocking because he told us before that everything has a reason, but remember that was talking about the general. Parts of them will sometimes not have a particular explanation of their object or purpose. And as regards the law, it appears to be impossible that it should not include some matter of this kind. You may be thinking, but God is perfect. Of course, God can make it so that everything will have a purpose. But you must ask, why must a lamb be sacrificed and not a ram? But the same question would be asked why a ram had been commanded instead of a lamb, so long as one particular kind is required. The same is to be said as to the question, why were 7 lambs sacrificed and not 8? The same question might have been asked if there were 8, 10, or 20, so long as some definite number of lambs were sacrificed. It is almost similar to the nature of a thing which can receive different forms, but only receives one of them. We must not ask why it has this form and not another, which is likewise possible, because we should have to ask the same question if instead of its actual form, the thing had any of the other possible forms. Note this and understand it. Now, I will absolutely agree that it takes a couple times reading through that to understand it. I'll come back to that sentence in just a sec. But what Rambam is trying to point out is that because we live in a world of particulars, we live in a world where 1 is different than 2, and 2 is different than 3. By definition, when God gives a command, which has a great and glorious purpose for us to obey, many of the details are going to be specific, and those specifics could have been otherwise. Take, for example, the wearing of a talit. God said that we put the fringes on the corner. Okay, we usually have 4 corners. That's fine. Now you could argue, why do we have 4 corners? Why not 3 corners? Why not 2 corners? Why not 50 corners? Why didn't we have more? Why make 4 the minimum number rather than making something else the minimum number? But that question only goes in circles, because if God had made it 50 corners, then I could have also asked, why not 49? Why not 51? By the very nature of having a particular world that we have to live within, because we live in this material world, surrounded by geese, I keep reminding myself, we are going to have to try and just live with the fact that sometimes it has to be A and not B. Just because something had to be picked, there had to be a decision, or else there would be no decision. And sometimes those decisions are just decisions. Sometimes those decisions are not indicative of any higher purpose. The greater commandment, absolutely, but the sub-details are not always indicative of anything more. Now, when he says, note this and understand it, that is a very important code whenever you're reading Rambam. Indeed, whenever you're reading most of the medieval commentators. Whenever a sage says, note this and understand it during this time period of history, what they are saying is, I just told you something that if I make it any clearer, will make somebody unprepared likely to become a heretic. That this is dangerous information in the wrong hands. Now, I feel safe talking about this because 1,000 other authors have already made it clear that that's what Rambam meant. and I'm not letting the cat out of the bag. And plus, I trust the people that are here, and you know that you can always talk to me if you get confused by it. Unlike Rambam, who once he published his book, it was out in the world and he was worried who would get a hold of it. And indeed, many people did misunderstand what he was saying. What he is trying to say is that, yes, if you think that you have to come up with an explanation for every last detail, and that there will always be a perfect explanation, then you are headed in the wrong direction. But for some people, hearing that would make them think that the commandments were pointless, that they couldn't differentiate between the general purpose of a commandment and each and every last final detail. And indeed, he was right to imagine that there were people, both in his generation and before him and after him, who might take their inability to understand every last detail of a commandment and how it's been interpreted by our tradition as a reason for heading out the door or uprooting Torah. So yes, there are people who will head that way. I believe they're going to head that way regardless of whether Rambam says this or not. But that was what he was worried about. But on the other hand, especially in the modern world where many people are heading out the door, not because of the issues of his day and age, but because of their unwillingness to recognize the bigger picture of the commandments, because they get caught up on the details and then say, I don't like them, so I won't accept the broader stroke either, recognizing that you don't have to find something suitable to your own rational understanding in order to be committed to the commandments down to the very last detail. The very last details are where we show our obedience. The broad strokes are where we gain our spiritual and emotional strength. Now, I need to continue because I noticed we're only at 12 minutes and I still have another paragraph. Like I said, we're a little long today in the text. The repeated assertion of our sages that there are reasons for all commandments and the tradition that Solomon knew them refer to the general purpose of the commandments and not to the object of every detail. It is incredibly liberating to realize that you don't have to come up with the perfect explanation for every last detail of every commandment, other than, well, that's how they were commanded to be done because it had to be done somehow. But here's why the general commandment was done and what I can learn and gain from its observance. Now, I did want to bring one last text also from Guide for the Perplexed that helps understand this whole purpose in the broader picture. There are persons who find it difficult to give a reason for any of the commandments and consider it right to assume that the commandments and prohibitions have no rational basis. Now, this is not somebody who is trying to reject the commandments. This is somebody who wants to keep the commandments, but wishes to deny that there are any reasons for them. Right? We're not talking about a heretic or an apostate. We are talking about somebody that believes themselves to be pious, but wants to remove any rationality, any reason, any idea of purpose from the commandments as part of our understanding of the commandments.
John, are you there?
I'm here, but I think we lost the rabbi. I missed you on Shabbat. I came up for the weekend.
Oh, so you have to let me know when you're coming again.
I will. I was telling the rabbi, I decided to join Temple Israel of Miami. Rabbi's back.
Oh, there he is.
We
There
missed
he
you.
is.
John, are you there? I'm here. Yep, the internet decided to go down. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish up. Unfortunately, this means the YouTube section won't get this, but we'll do the best we can. All right. Let me just change that. Make sure everyone has got it. All right, so back to our diseased soul. Okay, so right. But as things which are not objects of reason and serve no purpose, they would undoubtedly be attributed to God, because no thought of man could have produced them. All right, so this is the "it's so crazy, it must come from God" line of argument, where people actually want the commandments to seem crazy, because then they believe it's clear they must have come from God, because no sane human would have ever commanded those particular things. And that means by me following them, I am clearly submitting myself in submissiveness to the will of God and not to my own interpretation, my own ideas, my own commandments, because I would never have commanded myself to do that. All right, now you can already begin, hopefully by the tone of my voice, to see some of the weaknesses of this problem. According to the theory of these weak-minded person, man then is more perfect than his creator. For what man says or does has a certain object, whilst the actions of God are different. He commands us to do what is of no use to us and forbids us to do what is harmless. Far be this. It's like you literally are giving God less credit than you give humans. On the contrary, the sole object of the law is to benefit us. Thus, we explained the scriptural passage, "for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as it is this day," Deuteronomy 6, and again, "which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is wise and understanding people," from chapter 4. He says that even every one of these statutes convinces all nations of the wisdom and understanding it includes. But if no reason could be found for these statutes, if they produced no advantage and removed no evil, why then should he who believes in them and follows them be wise, reasonable, and so excellent as to raise the admiration of all nations? Right? God tells us other people will recognize the wisdom of the Torah. If the Torah had no wisdom, why would anyone ever say that it was wise? The Torah must have a wisdom that is perceptible to those that are outside of Judaism. It must have a wisdom that is perceptible to us. It must be wise. The truth is undoubtedly, as we have said, that every one of the 613 precepts serves to inculcate some truth, to remove some erroneous opinion, and to establish the proper relations in society, to diminish evil, to train in good manners, or to warn against bad habit. All this depends on three things: opinions, morals, and social conduct. These three principles suffice for a reason for every one of the commandments. Right? Recognize the enormity of what he just tried to say. If you want to know what a commandment does, you should be able to put it into at least one of these three categories: that it is training how we look at the world, that it is making us behave in a better way, or it is creating a better society for us and those around us. Many things will do all three, like, don't murder. But this is trying to tell us that all of them are important, and all of them all commandments can be found to be at least of one of these three categories. And so when we are trying to figure out what we should eat, which bird we should have, or anything like that, we have to recognize that there are reasons behind having this commandment. It is to inculcate a truth, to remove erroneous opinions, to establish proper relations in society, to diminish evil, to train in good manners, and warn against bad habits. that it is able to do some or all of those things as we take it into our life and follow it. We don't have to look for more hidden explanations than that. And indeed, for most of us, finding just those, any of those, is going to be absolutely immeasurable for making our own life better and making us happy and more secure in the way that we approach the world. And with that, after the technical snafu, we'll wrap it up. Questions or comments?
One question, comment. These are all birds of prey in this particular list, or in general, according to the commentary. And one thing that frustrates me about the many of the commentators, they're looking for a human-centric reason. And I sometimes want to step back and say, well, maybe, look, the question of cui bono isn't us directly. Perhaps this may be for the well-being and peace of the created world, in which case we are the indirect beneficiaries. Why don't we eat birds of prey? The idolaters do, and we look at the Philistines and 1 Samuel who have that problem with mice. Maybe the societies that leave their birds of prey alone don't have these things. It's not a direct benefit, but it's an indirect benefit. And we're too stupid, perhaps, to see what those indirect benefits are.
Indeed, like he said, with regards to the mitzvah of Orlah, the tree that is left alone for the first few years, it's sometimes hard to see those benefits to ourselves when we follow the commandments. Sometimes it takes what do they call it, a longitudinal study to uncover those connections. And indeed, it could very well be that these birds are important to the ecosystem, but would have been overlooked had we just gone ahead and eaten them without consideration to the broader picture. This is a case of where we would say yes and
Lost you.
We lost him again.
I lost him again.
Yeah,
it's because of the birds behind him.
That's right.
Have you ever found a goose that was kind?
No, Canadian geese are nasty. They lived in the pond by my high school, and they chased the students when we would go out the back door.
Yeah.
But I was going to tell you, it's.
Wait a minute. Where is he?
But Temple Israel Miami is a big Reformed synagogue. It's the old one here in Miami, so it's a whole new journey. And I understand you have some experience with that.
Oh yeah, 22 years working in a Reformed big synagogue. 1,300 families.
I imagine Temple Israel at one point had 1,300 families, but they're down to about 300 now, 200 maybe.
Okay.
Right. I am back on my phone.
Josh, are you back?
But we're going to wrap it up there because my internet died again in the house. So I'm not sure what's going on with it. But just wanted to say that's all for today, folks. And I'll go deal with my router.
Shalom. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you all for your patience.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, John.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay, I know now.